Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Northeastern Illinois University. As a courtesy to the performers and other patrons, we ask you to please silence and put away all cell phones, pagers, and other noise and light-making devices. Flash photography, video, and audio recording of this performance are strictly prohibited. We invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy the performance. Thank you.
Hello, dear friends, and thank you for joining me today, whether in person tonight or online. My name is Miran Choi, and I'm a graduate student majoring in applied music pedagogy on the cello here at Northeastern Illinois University. Tonight, I'm very excited to share this space with you with some amazing pieces of music that have shaped my studies at NEIU. Bookending the program are the Prelude, Allemande, and Gigue of Johann Sebastian Bach's Cello Suite No. 2 in D minor, which have been a steady presence in my studies throughout the pandemic. At the heart of our time here, and at the heart of my cello studies here, are the 7 etudes for violoncello solo, written by a composer who I regard as my personal hero, Korean-German composer Lee Sang-yoon. Before we continue with the program, I would like to express my wholehearted gratitude to my cello instructors, Dr. Leah Hagel-Kamen and Dr. Alexander Mitzik, members of my recital and thesis committee, Dr. Jaime Gorgojo, Dr. Peter Cheng, and Dr. Travis Heath, and all mentors, friends, and family who have supported me in reaching this point in my growth. I dedicate this lecture recital and my thesis to my late father, Choi Jung-bong. Now, our time here tonight will follow this roadmap of topics. First, Lee Sang-yoon and his compositional language. Second, approaching Yoon's etudes with a pedagogical lens. And third, the relevance of all of this to contemporary cello pedagogy. The intensity of Lee Sang-yoon's life, work, and influence in the post-war Koreas and in the sphere of European post-tonal music will be introduced to better illustrate the maturation of his compositional language. As you'll see here, from his 7 etudes, I have selected 4, paired by opposites in character, to present tonight. Before playing each of them, I will provide a brief overview of characteristics you can listen for. Further details about the etudes will be discussed during part 2 of the lecture, as well as my suggested pedagogical approaches to the set, and can also be found in tonight's program notes for your convenience. For more information on tonight's topic, I've included a short list of resources that may be of interest for your personal reading. Before verbally introducing the background and growth of the composer, I would like to allow the music to present itself first by playing the first of Yoon's etudes, Legato. As the title or character indication suggests, this is a study of bow control and navigating how to shape simple rhythms in an uncommon, uneven meter of 5/4 time to flow as legato. Correspondingly, with a relatively slow suggested tempo, another objective in this etude is developing a keener sensitivity to nuances in dynamics and tone colors. I will never forget the first time I listened to the seven etudes when I first started studying them in the height of the pandemic in fall 2020. I was simultaneously afraid to breathe, fearing it would interfere with the subtleties of the dynamics in a recording. Yet I felt myself freely swaying to the etude's uneven lilt. It was around this time I came across this quote from Yoon himself. Each smaller sound figure must contain the basic concept of the entire piece, and each of my pieces must contain the whole of my musical world. It can be said that even in the initial note, this low C sharp under the fermata at the beginning contains the entire etude, one that emerges from silence and returns to silence on the same pitch. This ascending minor sixth, written either linearly or stacked vertically as a double stop, is a recurring motive in his otherwise through-composed set of etudes, as you will see in the following slide. Each of these samples have been extracted from each of the seven etudes. Now, another detail you may have noticed in the last two slides is his incredible specificity in dynamic levels. For those of you who may not have had much exposure to seeing Western European sheet music, I've pulled an example from standard orchestral literature. This is an excerpt from Beethoven's Fifth Symphony to better illustrate the difference. On these dynamics, musicologist Walter Wolfgang Sparer with the International Isangyun Society includes in his program notes for the third etude, Parlando, the fact that Yoon wanted the parlando to be executed as a whispering conversation demonstrates the relative nature of his dynamic markings. The instrumentalist is supposed to realize the fortissimo notated a couple times in this etude on the basis of the idea of intensive whispering. Now, if we take a look at this, I personally don't know anyone who whispers in double tones or in fortissimo, or triple fortissimo for that matter. But all this to say that he means this in a relative sense. Let us now move on to part one of tonight's lecture, an introduction to Isangyun and its compositional language. Isangyun was born in Doksanmyeon, which would be in present-day South Korea, on September 17, 1917, to a yangban or educated aristocrat family. In spite of the turmoil that came with the Japanese annexation of Korea during this time, including the suppression of Korean cultural identity, the family's relocation to what would be present-day Dongyong opened the door to Yoon's access to a traditional style of Korean education. According to Alan Westby, an arts and music librarian with the Los Angeles Public Library, Yoon gained a grounding in Eastern thought, studying Confucianism, Taoism, and the Chinese classics beginning at the age of 5. When his father enrolled him in a school run under the traditional Korean system. Taoist and Buddhist mysticism had a profound effect on Yoon, and he was later to claim that over 70% of his compositions were inspired by these influences. His musical life can be divided into 3 periods, beginning with the musical studies at a Japanese-run Western-style school, where he picked up violin against his father's wishes, as music was considered to be a trade for lower-class folk. In spite of this, he later picked up the cello, music theory, and composition, all while concealing his Korean identity. Yoon was eventually caught, imprisoned, and tortured, and upon release needed to flee back to Korea. The story goes he fled with only his cello, tying a rope and letting it down his window before flying home with it, which, to put it in today's context, even flying with a cello on an airplane is not an easy feat today. He is among the major contributors who helped to revive Korean cultural activity after World War II, teaching music in the Korean language, and composing children's songs and film scores for years before his endeavors brought him to Paris and Berlin. Here, he's exposed to 12-tone serialism and enters his second period of composition, in which he develops his own compositional language and develops his Haupttone or main tone technique, which I will discuss in more detail later. His second period is where his official oeuvre begins. Most other pieces before then were either withdrawn by Yoon or now considered lost. More tragedy struck the Yoon family when he and his wife were kidnapped by the secret police of South Korea in 1967, charged with espionage after Yoon had taken a tour of a historical site in North Korea he sought inspiration from. Initially sentenced to life in prison and tortured by his own people, an international petition of protest for their release, signed by fellow musicians you may recognize, Stravinsky, Boulez, Karajan, allowed for their return to West Germany, where they remained effectively in exile. It is during this period where he begins to explore themes of what he experienced in his 2 years in prison. This troubled journey of questioning identity and hardship is captured in his autobiographical cello concerto, composed in his third period in 1978. He includes in his notes for the score for the cello concerto that since I played myself the cello in my youth, it made sense for me to give the solo instrument autobiographical traits. My thoughts, my experiences, and my feelings resonate in this solo part, which expresses a whole life in concert with the environment of the orchestra. This third period, lasting from 1975 to his passing in 1995, was a period of aiming for broader communication and easier comprehension, phasing out 12-tone practices and returning to more melodic writing. It is here where most of his works for chamber music, chamber ensembles emerge, and where he employs older Western forms, specifically the symphony and the concerto. He is more outspoken during this period about the politics of his homeland, specifically concerning the reunification of the two Koreas. He had attempted to arrange joint Korean concerts, and his efforts led him to be among the few individuals regarded highly by both Koreas today. This pardon and recognition from South Korea, however, would not come during his lifetime, as disputes with the government prevented him from returning for the rest of his life. At the time of writing his etudes in 1993, the Isangyun Music Institute was founded in Pyongyang, and he became an honorary member of the International Society of Contemporary Music. He was invited as a guest professor of poetics at the Mozarteum College for Music and Performing Arts in Salzburg, where he delivered several recorded lectures on his music. His particular attention to the dynamics and articulation and the ways in which he treats tones and interwoven phrases pushes both listeners and practitioners to reevaluate how we might intuitively interpret them. According to Walter Wolfgang Sparer, the dynamic specifications too have a different meaning than generally usual in European music. A crescendo hairpin in no way means a continuous increase, and a decrescendo hairpin in no way a continuous decrease in the intensity of tone. On the contrary, a crescendo is to be implemented late and a decrescendo as early as possible. What he calls quote-unquote Asian glissandi are also to be executed differently than those by Western composers, late and thus not uniformly as a continuous process, as seemingly suggested by the notation. The Asian glissando is rather a legato extension of the tone, either as a final sound fading into the indefinite or pressing forward into the next tone. The rhythm must remain distinguishable. Yoon explains to Sparer in My Path, My Ideal, My Music, my musical gestures come from Korean traditions. Asian traditional music did not follow counterpoint or harmony, and therefore tones in such music had to be performed in a completely different manner in order to bring out its distinct character as living matter. There stemmed many differentiation of tones, as well as countless types of glissando and vibrato. To elaborate how this applies to Yoon composing for stringed instruments, let's take a look at the traditional Korean performance concept, shigimse. According to the Sejong Cultural Society, shigimse, or embellishment or decoration, animates pitches and in doing so gives them direction and shape. Shigimse is not only the pitch itself, but how the pitch is performed in the context of a melody. In Korean modal practice, these pitch gestures are key to distinguishing the characteristics from one mode of those to another, even if the reference pitch content is the same. Shigimse also means fermentation, or the degree of maturity within an aging process. When we apply it to stringed instruments, this manner of ornamentation is called nonghyun. Before we get into that, here is a sample of how these ornamentations would be written out in Western notation. A relatively clumsy process, but this shows how much freedom each performer has in working out these ornamentations and thus creating their own style. Applied to string instruments, this manner of ornamentation is called nonghyun, relating to play, and hyun referring to strings. And there are 4 types of sound in this category. Yosung is probably the most familiar to us as it translates to vibrating sound, very much like Western style vibrato. Jeonsung means a rolling sound. Taesung is to slide from a higher to a lower pitch, and the opposite chusung is to slide from a lower to a higher pitch. To better illustrate these techniques, let's watch them in practice. Here, I've included a sample of a sanjo performance from the National Gugak, or Traditional Music Center, featuring a lower-pitched bowed string instrument called the ajeng, which is a mid to low register stringed instrument accompanied by a drum called a jangu, which is off a frame. Sanjo can be loosely translated as scattered melodies, and is a genre of instrumental chamber music featuring an instrumental solo with jangu, occasionally with chimse or exclamations from the percussionist for audience engagement and to encourage the soloist. As you watch and listen, please note the wideness with which the player bends a pitch, the timing, and the effects that brief breaths have in uniting these scattered melodies. You can see samples of these ornamental techniques referenced throughout his etudes, as shown here. The only technique I don't have an example of is yosung, or vibrating sound, as Yoon does not specify instructions on vibrato, and the inclusion of this will largely depend on the discretion of the cellist playing these etudes. The top sample you see here is from measure 94 of burlesque, or the 4th etude, and it is an example of jeonsung, or the rolling sound on the 2nd to 3rd beats, and it's produced by pressing a string forcefully and quickly releasing. The bottom sample is from measure 26 of leggero, the 2nd etude, and it is of both chusung and taesung, or ascending and descending sliding pitches respectively. It is with this idiom that Lee Sang-yoon crafts what he calls his main tone or haptone technique, or if it's implied in a denser texture with a larger ensemble, he calls this Hauptklang. While Haupttone typically refers to primary stresses in linguistics, Yoon adapts this word to describe a compositional technique consisting of 3 processes on a selected tone. First, preparatory ornamental phrasing to accent the main tone. Second, a development of the main tone. And third, a denouement, or a resolution of the activity. These parts form one unified entity, and excuse me, these weave together seemingly scattered melodic ideas. To hear this applied in his music, I've prepared a sample and a slight spoiler from the next etude I have prepared called Leggero. In these measures, we can see his treatment of approaching E, or the highest note in this passage, as his main or Haupttone, emerging from the context of a high G sharp not pictured here. We see a quotation of style number 26, which you could reference in your handout, from the figure with adapted shigimse and the beat immediately before the prolonged E. From there, we have a series of tezang or downward glissandi before a reversed, adapted version of number 22, which lands us on a quickly resolved E. It's this E that he emphasizes with this phrasing. Now, this next etude, Leggero, is by all means a much lighter character with more rhythmic variation. The practitioner is challenged to maintain a light touch while expressing percussive accents, long crescendi, and extended loud passages in the cello's upper register. With these two samples, let's now move on to lecture part 2, approaching Yoon's etudes with a pedagogical lens. These 7 etudes, as shown in an earlier slide, are named with character indications or the etude's primary technical focus: legato, leggero, parlando, burlesque, dolce, triller, and doppelgriffe or double stops. I seem to have a habit mentally confusing the title Triller for Michael Jackson's Thriller, and I assure you that the two have no relation, and I apologize if I mispronounce it as such tonight. Yoon had composed these etudes as a kind of compendium for contemporary techniques and for his compositional language. Though he doesn't use new aspects of Western notation as he does for his glissé for cello solo, Yoon encourages the practitioner to reconsider timings in glissandi and dynamic changes. Dr. Ji-Yeon Ko from Louisiana State University writes about his works for cello and mentions that Yoon found this approach much more direct than training finger patterns or bowing techniques through standard etudes such as Popper or Piatti. For the same reason, Yoon, however, does not provide the specific fingerings or bowings in this etude. In general, even though it may not bring tremendous technical progress to the cellist, they are very helpful resources in contemporary writing and his style. In contrast to what she says, I would argue that these etudes offer a different type of technical progress that is not necessarily outwardly visible. Yoon prompts the cellist to consider the holistic art of our craft, that is, employing all contact points and playing areas on the instrument, developing the ability to use the full length of the bow in context of different characters, honing an intense attention to detail and nuances, and essentially leaving a wide open question to the cellist. How will you approach and embody what is asked of you by these etudes? Now, you may be wondering, how in the world do you begin to answer this question and begin understanding this set of etudes, let alone teach it? I continued to mull over this question with some words I'd preferred to leave out of this recorded recital. With my study of these etudes in a continuously unfolding process, as is the lifelong journey one may take in learning an instrument, I would like to suggest a few frames of perspective and exercises that have helped me in starting to learn these 4 etudes. If we were to compare the structure of these etudes with one of the staples of cello etudes, for example, the first etude from Popper's High School of Violoncello Playing, or as I sometimes lovingly refer to it as, with proper spelling, of course, we quickly see that the approaches we would have used for Popper do not apply here. Whereas Popper's etudes typically follow an ABA form as a whole and remain in a tonal context, Yoon's post-tonal etudes do not follow a predictable pattern or form, nor do larger phrases ever repeat. There are larger or smaller melodic motives that recur, such as this 3-note ascending scale in both the legato and dolce, and an emphasis on melodic or chordal 6 in all 7 etudes. The time signatures appear to be arranged symmetrically, beginning in 5/4, peaking in 3/4 with the middle etude, and returning to 5/4 by the end. Going further with this comparison with Popper, there are usually several apparent highlighted techniques to be studied within each etude that can be observed from the very beginning. Here we can see that the primary techniques would be establishing a healthy baseline détaché or detached stroke, cleanliness of string crossings, and smaller shifts on the neck area of the fingerboard. With Yoon etudes, each one is a self-contained world of teaching points, and I have created 3 large categories in listing these teaching points for each etude: general, left hand, and bow arm. Now, going quickly in order, I've compiled teaching points for all 7, and I will be only reading the general points. Developing sensitivity to dynamics with simple subdivisions dominates legato. For leggero, rhythmic variation comes to the forefront. For parlando, speaking articulation and capturing volatile character becomes important here. For burlesque, we build on top of what's established in parlando with exaggerating character opposites, lyrical versus dense. For dolce, we focus on nuances in quiet dynamics. And with triller, we focus on trills versus rapidly moving lyrical material and timings of grace notes. And last but not least, with doppelgriffe, we see intonation of double stops as a critical exercise to refine. Though the program note for these etudes indicates that these are progressive etudes, because of the through-composed, standalone nature of these etudes, I argue that they can be learned in order of the practitioner's needs. With this, I would like to share my approach in learning these etudes with my teachers. The beauty of having minimal directions on bowings and fingerings, save for slurs and occasional string indications, is the freedom that the practitioner has in figuring out fingerings that work best. If a cellist studying these etudes has not had much experience crafting their own fingerings or has not had much exposure to Jean-Louis Duport's etudes, which is considered the basis of modern cello fingering guidelines, this would pose a slightly daunting but fruitful challenge. Questions that we may ask ourselves in this process may include: does this passage work best with the warmth of playing in the higher position or in the lower string with the clarity of a lower position on a higher string? Which finger would serve me best for showing this motivic pattern? Or can I justify shifting up on the same string, or is it better to smoothly cross strings here? Once one decides on fingerings, another stepping stone that unlocks is the ability to craft open string exercises. In doing this, one can better isolate the ideal bow apportionment, weight, and contact point needed for passages demanding of the left hand, or in subtly changing dynamic levels. Refining balance of double stop voicings, dedicate attention towards articulation of accents, which there are many, and clean up string crossings. This open string approach serves an accessibility purpose as well. I have created open string versions of these etudes during a period in my studies last year when I suffered an injury to my left wrist, which aggravated chronic tendonitis. But by going through the score in this manner, by using a digital scan of the score and with score reading apps like Fourscore on an iPad, I color-coded each note with the strings I would be playing them on. And the strings are color-coded blue for C, green for G, yellow for D, and red for A. But you can use whichever color you like. This method may help with cellists who have difficulties reading for any reason, perhaps dyslexia. But if the colors are too distracting, it may be helpful to write or rewrite the etude as open strings only on notation software. Once one feels secure with playing these etudes on open strings, we can then address the busy subdivisions in all etudes besides legato. To make sense of these rhythms, let's refer back to ornamentations in traditional Korean music. The risk of playing these etudes strictly in time and letting the counting dominate the phrasing of one's playing is that we lose sight of Yun's Haupttone, or the main note receiving these layers of ornamentation. By identifying these main tones, we have another tool to inform our phrasing in addition to Yun's demanding dynamic instructions. Taking this approach can better inform how we deconstruct and learn the fourth etude, burlesque, which is labeled in the etudes program notes as a rhythm-centric study. While none of these etudes have extended passages directly quoting the figures from the chart of examples of traditional ornamentation, we may see, or we can see, altered figures that use similar shapes, as shown here. Using this approach to visually simplify a given measure can help shape a sort of post-tonal Schenkerian-esque analysis that may help us to find how half-tone technique over longer musical passages. After these initial and often very, very, very time-intensive steps, we can begin to put together the etude as written, taking care to prioritize a steady focus on full body investment while playing. This involvement is especially critical in longer notes and rests, as Yoon encourages the cellist in those notes to remain engaged in whatever occurs between large beats. This includes the preparation and connection of larger movements in posture, breathing, the shoulders, upper arms, and in order to connect what Yoon in effect presents as a modern day sanjo piece or a scattered melody piece. This portion of approaching the etudes is the most difficult. With little in the way of familiarity to grasp, I found myself training not just the physical awareness, but most importantly, stamina in focus and internal engagement. Now, next, the burlesque is the etude that challenged me the most so far, with bringing out the humorous or exaggerated character while maintaining a dance-like flow. It functions as the median in the set of etudes, being the only one in 3/4 time, and appears to foreshadow the crux of the final etude in the set, toggling between double stops and lyrical interjections. It is also here where his wry sense of humor begins to fully manifest in his writing for cello. With the blurring of genres, widespread challenging of previously unquestioned norms in classical music, and the move into a period of collective restructuring and reflection on music pedagogy, one may wonder where these etudes, perhaps Yoon's cello works and other similar efforts in postmodern classical music, stand in modern relevance. My intention tonight in sharing Yoon's music is not to attempt to respond to this uncertainty with an absolute, as I myself have been left with more questions than I started with. Ultimately, etudes are used as aids to refine one's technique, as preparatory material for pieces from currently available literature, and as frameworks through which practitioners can continue to explore the sonic possibilities of their instrument. The all-encompassing nature of Yoon's etudes pushes the practitioner to develop a keen awareness of all parts that go into playing the cello. Today, there are many perspectives one may approach learning with, including body-centered approaches, for example, pairing this study with the study of the Alexander technique, Feldenkrais, and/or yoga, cognition or perception-centered approaches, such as metacognition, perhaps even phenomenology, if you're so inclined, or hybrids of the two categories as seen in Ivan Galamian's Principles of Violin Playing and Teaching, and Paul Rowland's Teaching the Action of String Playing, which balances action with theory. As a student and emerging educator interested in the cognition and perception end of music, I've been finding the study of these etudes to be both fulfilling and very humbling. Fulfilling in that they have encouraged me to explore further sound possibilities and to instill a similar curiosity in the students that I currently teach. But it's humbling in that the learning process pushes one out of the comforts of consonance and narrow focus. When it comes to accessing works for cello composed in the 20th century onwards, we run into the unique challenge of a lack of consistency in notation, the intricacies of getting acquainted with a composer's unique language, and seemingly needing to start from scratch with every new composer we run into. Dr. Valerie Wellbanks, a graduate of Goldsmiths College, University of London, writes in her 2016 dissertation that while much has been achieved in the systemization and pedagogy of extended techniques for wind players, string players, and particularly cellists have a conspicuous lack of materials available to them. When looking at filling this gap, and creating a complete overview of extended technique for the cello, one has to inquire why it has not been codified in the same way as traditional technique. What efforts have already been made, and why have they had limited success? She later provides a list of composers in the last century who have published cello etudes, including Yoon, and mentions Yoon's etudes as contributing nothing specifically new to the repertoire regarding technique, nor do they deepen the understanding of style and aesthetics in this cultural cross-pollination. Now I argue, while they do not introduce graphic or aleatoric notation or extended techniques found in the likes of Penderecki or Gubaidulina, Yoon's etudes serve as a gateway into his compositional language and as a more comprehensive approach to refining cello technique. It helps that this set is among the more accessible in the collection of postmodern etudes that's out there. Much like how method systems such as the Suzuki method have built-in plateau or review pieces integrated to refine familiar techniques before introducing a new element, Yoon's etudes could be the summit in postmodernism. helping to narrow the sizable, roughly century-long gap between this new sound world and the likes of Popper's etudes. This final etude I would like to share is my personal favorite, Dolce. This is the only etude in the set to require a mute, and this is a study in quieter, warmer nuances in the cello's register. To summarize our time tonight, the composer Lee Sang-yoon invites us to partake in his musical language through his 7 etudes for violoncello solo. As he writes for an instrument he considers his lifelong companion. In his efforts, we are introduced to idioms he references and the workings of his matured composition style. We are fully invited to see how in his work each smaller sound figure must contain the bigger, basic concept of the entire piece, and how each of his pieces must contain the whole of his musical world. In sharing my in-progress analysis of his etudes, it is my hope that my research will inspire further interest in the life and work of this fascinating composer, who dedicated his life and his efforts not just to crafting his own sound, but to the world around him. I mentioned at the start of my lecture that Yoon is a personal hero of mine, and I say this because while growing up, even though I was born in the States and would only visit Korea well into early adulthood, I always wondered if music would be an avenue in reunification efforts between the two Koreas. I would daydream of musicians from different backgrounds on the same peninsula coming together to connect in a unified tone. Little did I know, until learning of Lee Sang-yoon, that it is thanks to his sentiments towards his homeland, his wish for a concert organized with musicians from both Koreas. It isn't until I learned about him and his efforts that have led me to learn that he was the driving reason why there was an ensemble formed 3 years after his passing that led to such a collaboration of the two Koreas. I was and continue to be moved by his promotion of peace and reconciliation, his drive to communicate and shape his unique world of tones, and his humble wish for his music to instill hope, courage, and comfort in those who play it. Thank you for your time and presence and for allowing me to share with you my excitement for the life and music of Lee Sang-yoon. As previously mentioned, I will be closing our time tonight with a bookend, the Gigue, 2-box suite in D minor, the last movement in this suite, and among the first pieces from my studies at NEIU. Thank you.